Hello and welcome to this HSC Masterclass on the significant person of Al-Ghazali for Islam. Now first we're going to begin by turning to the syllabus. As mentioned there, it is important that you know your syllabus, and I'm sure you've already read through the syllabus cover to cover at this particular point in time. But in terms of today, we're going to focus on looking at differentiating between those two main aspects highlighted in red, the contribution and the impact. And in terms of the contribution, it's both to the development and the expression, and there are some subtle differences between those two areas that we'll look at as we progress through the presentation. But at the bottom there, just having a look at what the difference is between contribution and impact. So when we refer to the contribution, in many respects, we're focusing for Al-Ghazali on what did he do for Islam and its adherents. And a number of the slides throughout this presentation will focus on the way in which he responded to some of the key issues of his time, the issues, the challenges that Islam faced, and as a consequence that Al-Ghazali felt that he needed to respond to. And then in terms of impact, in many ways, it's the consequences of those contributions. But ultimately, why is he significant? And why is he significant enough to remember in relation to Islam? Which sort of leads into that whole idea of what is his endearing legacy for Islam. And it's for someone like Al-Ghazali's case, his legacy extends beyond even the realm of Islam. Now we have the various outcomes as part of the syllabus. I simply put these up just to draw your attention to the fact that when the exam writers are writing the exam that most likely would have already been written at this stage, these are the outcomes that they will use as the basis for the exam. So it is important just to make sure that you go through, that you understand that, and you can use that to actually create some of the practice questions that you might actually use in relation to any aspect of studies of religion, and in this case, with Al-Ghazali. But what I want to focus on is this idea of the spirit of the syllabus, what the syllabus is really drawing your attention to. And in terms of studies of religion, all the way back from year 11 up until now, it has been shaping your understanding of religion in relation to the way that, in the case of Islam, in this video, how is Islam a living religious tradition? So even though we're studying Al-Ghazali, and this video is focusing exclusively on Al-Ghazali, it is really important that we think about Al-Ghazali in the context of the entire faith, and your understanding, your knowledge of content of Islam as a whole will be very useful when it comes time to writing responses on Al-Ghazali. And at the bottom there, that's something that I always highlight to my students, that the key religions such as Islam, while we're looking at them, and certainly there's a lot of history that is connected with these religions, that in terms of religion, while we're studying it, it's also lived. And for the adherents of faiths such as Islam, it's something that isn't just a history lesson or something to look at, but it's something that they live in their day-to-day lives. And so what we need to connect is, how does someone like Al-Ghazali, who lived and died such a long time ago, how is he still relevant, and how is he still someone that matters to the adherents living in today? So for the purposes of understanding any individual in studies of religion, the 3 C's is a good understanding of how to focus your attention on the key aspects of your individual. So firstly, we'll look at context. And in terms of context, we're looking at the historical background. So a lot of the biographical stuff that most likely your teachers maybe spent a lesson or a couple of lessons going through, the importance of that is establishing the context. And I'll explain how you can use that for your responses as we go on. Then it's contribution, like we mentioned, so the influences on the faith itself. And then finally, the consequences, so that impact, so the significance of the individual, why are they remembered? Because think about the billions upon billions of people that that have lived and will live on Earth. There's only a select sample, really, that are actually deemed significant enough that we remember in history. And so a lot of that has to do with the contributions they did and the ongoing legacy that they have in our life. So first I'm going to take you through this whole idea of context, because it really is important to make sense of a lot of the biographical details that, as I said, you've probably spent copious hours looking through, but I really want to make things a little bit easier for you so you can kind of just draw the most important aspects of that biography rather than thinking that every single biographical detail is important. So, the question, do I need to remember everything? That is an enduring question in itself. And certainly, as I mentioned, if we were to look at someone like Ghazali, there's a lot that we could cover in terms of his biography. Even if, for those of you studying modern history or ancient history, there are a number of historical figures that we could look at, but very rarely do you need to know their entire life from beginning until end. So the biographical details are not important in isolation. It's really looking at those facts and thinking, how are they significant to making points, particularly in this case, in regards to contribution and impact. So whenever you're including biographical details, always consider why you believe that they are important to refer to. Don't just mention biographical details for the sake of showing that you remembered intricate facts about it, because a lot of the biographical details, really, they might help you in a game of trivia, but they're not really going to add quality to your short answer responses or your extended responses. And as mentioned, always think about the way in which the biographical links to the contribution and or impact on the life of Islamic adherents. So in terms of the importance of context, what I've done here, I've tried to just break down just a couple of key aspects of his life. I haven't, for the purpose of this presentation, decided to go through his entire life because I don't think that really gets to the heart of where you need to go to prepare for the HSC. So facts such as, that he was born in 1058 in Tuz, which is modern day Iran. Okay, it's certainly good to know that, but why is it good to know that? So knowing the year and the place of birth, for Al-Ghazali's case, it shows that he was born, at a time when Islam had great significance and influence in the world. So it wasn't a case where Islam was still an emerging faith. It was at a time where, in some ways, it was probably in its golden age or its peak of influence. And so he was, in many ways, born at the right time and the right place to actually exert some influence that will lead to greater impacts down the line. So in terms of his early education, simply important in the sense that he's someone who grew up learning the faith. So we know at this point in time that he was someone that certainly was a great intellectual in terms of Islam, and that started all the way from a young age. It wasn't something that he decided to pick up later on, that he in many ways lived the faith and he learnt the faith from a very young age. Likewise, when we look at biographical details such as he and his brother being cared for by their father's Sufi friend, and that's how they were taught to read and write. Again, it's nice biographical information, but ultimately it indicates that is the early influence of Sufism, and Sufism certainly is a major part of his contribution, but also his impact. Also, when we're looking at some of the wide range of issues and subjects and topics that he studied, Arabic, Persian, the Quran, principles of religion, etc., it's simply highlighting that he had a good foundation for his later study. And again, very similar to the idea of his early education, shows that he was someone who knew what he was talking about, knew what he was doing, and so he has some authority when he's discussing some of the key points that we'll look at, particularly in his writings. And the last point there, in terms of where he was a professor at, okay, it highlights that he had a high status within Islam at the time. He certainly would have been surrounded by the cream of the crop when it comes to the experts in Islam, but not only that, because he was surrounded by the great minds and certainly the great thinkers and so forth, that again he had an opportunity to have a real significant influence on Islam. Now I've called it a coming of age story. It's something that your teachers may have mentioned. Certainly, if you look online, you'll find this story of where he was, he encounters some bandits or robbers, and they take his books. And obviously, for any person that loves learning, to lose your books is a big thing. But Al-Ghazali, in many ways, learnt a lesson here that he took to heart. Again, it's not something that you're probably going to need to include in your responses, but it shows, I guess, for the purposes of context, that this story shows why he was able to remember and why he chose to remember so much of his understanding of Islam, because the whole idea was that the bandit said, well, how significant or how good is your knowledge of Islam if you require these books in order to understand them and to know it. And ultimately that is one of the reasons of many that sort of drew him to the sciences of the heart, this Sufism. So it's not just about what in terms of the head, but it's also important to know Islam in terms of the heart, to really take to heart the fundamental principles of Islam. The other big aspect of his life that sometimes we draw attention to is his spiritual crisis. Okay, I know some people might regard it as a midlife crisis of sorts, but this spiritual crisis is particularly important in leading him to his some of his significant contributions, particularly the way in which it drew him to Sufism, and he uses his own experiences of this spiritual crisis to articulate why Sufism is a perfectly legitimate part of Islam, and no doubt drew a lot of Muslims into that particular idea. And in many ways, it was his own internal struggle between rational intelligence and the spirit, the world, the afterlife, what truly matters. So those big questions that are at the heart of any religion, that they were kind of the big questions that he was dealing with. And in some ways, it kind of is replicated in some of the challenges that we'll look at that Islam itself was facing. The idea of rational thinking, reason versus faith, and in this case, I put it, is the head more important than the heart, and sort of drawing our attention back to his personal struggle. This exit from public life and fame, in many ways, was letting go of his ego and focusing on, for Al-Ghazali, what he believed was truly important to be a good Muslim adherent. So, again, what I put here, you could certainly come up with some other challenges. This is just I've thought of three different challenges that faced Islam at his time that he in particular responded to as part of his contributions, and his legacy sort of ties into this. So the first one is this rising influence of ancient Greek philosophy on Islamic thought. So I've put there, philosophy versus religion, faith versus reason. There are certain ways that you might be able to, I guess for your responses, just get to the heart of the matter with regards to what his contributions were. The second one, this idea of sectarianism. And each of these challenges is sort of in and out of aspects of a number of his contributions. So in this case, the political conflict between Sunni and Shiite, and certainly he at times walked a very delicate tightrope and really trying to respond to this challenge. And a lot of his writings, he was very much aware of the issues that face this, even though he was obviously more on the Sunni side. He was able to somewhat balance aspects of Islamic thought to to not create issues, and hopefully in what he was attempting to resolve some of those issues. And the last part there, I've mentioned this whole idea of head versus heart. It sort of really looks at the division between Islamic law, Sharia, and Sufism, and sort of in many ways looking at the way in which he legitimizes Sufism and kind of helps to bring Sufism more into the mainstream of Islam. So let's have a look at his contribution here. And as you can see, again, I've tried to just summarize some of these contributions, and just to take it a bit further, trying to identify some differences between development of Islam and expression of Islam. Even though when we look at some practice questions, you don't always have to separate them, but I think it's important to consider that there are some differences between development and expression. So in terms of the idea of development of Islam, we can put certainly his written works. Now, he wrote countless books and works, but for the purposes of this presentation and this masterclass, I've chosen to focus in on three of his prominent works, in particular because we can certainly link them to his response to some of the challenges that I mentioned earlier. His critique of Kalam theology and Sufism are certainly part of this development of Islam. So the way in which he contributed to the ongoing process of Islam moving from his context into the future. On the other side, in terms of the expression, we're getting into aspects of that living aspect, the way in which adherents live their faith, looking at his contribution and impact later on to the education system. Again, that whole aspect of challenging sectarianism, because that's obviously a major part of the way that Muslims will express their faith. And once again, Sufism comes in with this whole idea of the place of Islamic mysticism. Sufism does have a place in Islam, in Al-Ghazali's time, and we really sort of focus in on his contribution to the way that Sufism could become a part of the way in which a Muslim adherent lives their life within that faith. So firstly, looking at this whole idea of the critique of Kalam, and when we refer to that, we're referring to Islamic theology. So as mentioned there, it's a discipline within Islamic thought that seeks to articulate and defend the principles of Islamic faith through rational argumentation and systematic theology. Okay, that sounds really intense, but again, it gets to this whole idea of the focus in on rationality and sort of this focus in on knowledge, which later on we can sort of see how that whole idea of head versus heart, that's something I'll keep referring to, because I think it's a good, simple way of sort of getting, excuse the pun, the heart of the matter when it comes to Al-Ghazali. So part of this as well was this the need to defend Islamic beliefs against philosophical and theological challenges from within, as well as from outside of the Muslim community. And this whole idea of Islamic theology was being very heavily influenced by this re-emergence of ancient Greek philosophy. So in particular, one of the schools of thought, the Mu'tazile, an earlier school that places a stronger emphasis on reason and rationality. So they focused in on this whole idea of human free will and justice. And again, this whole idea of rationality and the necessity for humans to use intellect to understand religious truths. And in terms of Al-Ghazali, he critiqued this over-reliance on rationalism. And while acknowledged that there is value in knowing the faith in terms of the theology, that not much point having that faith if it's not really being matched by the way you live your faith and being able to live according to the teachings of Islam. So in many ways he was trying to deal with the excesses of philosophy. Philosophy is good and it's important, but it shouldn't take away from the beauty, I guess, of living according to a particular faith, in this case, Islam. In terms of Sufism, in terms of your contribution, again, at this particular time, some of the Sufis, in terms of their mysticism, were sort of straying away a little bit from some of the core tenets of Islam. So Al-Ghazali really tried to bridge this divide between the jurists and the Sufis by demonstrating that reason and spirituality are not mutually exclusive, but they're actually complementary. Having reason and having a deep faith, a deep spirituality, they go hand in hand. And certainly, Al-Ghazali's personal example as a Sufi helped this. And he emphasizes that a complete and genuine practice of Islam requires both adherence to Sharia, so Islamic law, as well as inner spirituality. And in many ways focuses on the sincerity of it. That again, knowing the ins and outs of Islam, while important, if it's not being backed up with the way you live your life, then that's where it loses part of its meaning. So while he affirmed the importance of the law, he still criticized the jurists for focusing too much on the legalistic aspects of the religion rather than the way one actually lives their faith. Not making it too mechanical and sort of that it is a lived religious tradition, and that's one way that you can kind of draw your attention back to that whole idea of how we contributed to Islam being a living religious tradition. So even for Muslims today that are not part of Sufism, but they can certainly look to someone like Al-Ghazali, who was an intellectual but didn't let that focus on knowledge take away from the way he lived his faith, because that was what was most important. Okay, in terms of the way in which he challenged sectarianism, in many ways his big challenge, his big idea was he really wanted to stress the importance of unity. So the Ummah, the community of Muslim believers. So he stressed the core tenets of Islam. Again, he used his great knowledge of Islam, the belief in one God, the prophethood of Muhammad, the adherence to the Quran, the Sunnah, and he focused on the aspects that were common to both Sunni and Shiite. So while there are certainly differences, it's really getting to the heart of what are the similar aspects in terms of the way they live their faith, how they live as good Muslim adherents. So even though, as I mentioned, he was a Sunni scholar, he still recognized that there is legitimacy in different interpretations and schools of thought within Islam. And so he shows a lot of respect for those different views, which helps to bring the two major variants together and challenges this idea of sectarianism. And in particular, he focuses in on the extremism of both sides. And again, one of the key aspects you can always draw your attention to in terms of Al-Ghazali is that he really was about balance. It was about trying to reconcile differences and trying to find some sort of common ground in the middle. And as it mentions there, his defense of Sunni orthodoxy was done in a way that aimed to be inclusive rather than exclusive, and looked at the way in which different views could still be accommodated. And again, his integration of Sufi spirituality, it went beyond sectarian bounds. It wasn't neither Sunni or Shiite. So again, his main thing was, okay, regardless of the differences you may face in terms of aspects of knowledge, understanding of Islam, at the heart again of living the faith is your personal relationship with God and your moral behavior, rather than some of the differences between the variants of Islam. So then, looking at his writings as contributions, focusing on perhaps his most famous work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And it is important to remember that while he certainly critiques aspects of philosophy, he's someone who did a lot of learning of his own. He was well read, he understood the philosophy and used his knowledge of philosophy to critique aspects of it. But in particular, he focused his critiques on where the philosophy got in the way of his idea of where Muslims should be focusing in on their belief. So in particular, it was a written response to particular philosophers that were influenced by Plato and Aristotle. And he was responding to this challenge of where philosophy was threatening aspects of Islamic orthodoxy. And ultimately, one of his key criticisms presented in this particular text was their reliance on reason over revelation, which is a big part of Islamic faith. And as mentioned, he studies philosophy and uses that to dismantle it. So there on the screen, I've also put the opposing viewpoints, so what the viewpoints of these philosophers were, and Al-Ghazali's response. So I'm not going to go through all of these because they're there, and you'll have access to this presentation. But one of the key points was looking at aspects of Plato and Aristotle. They claimed the world is eternal and uncreated. So that since God is eternal, the world is eternal. And Al-Ghazali responded that by insisting that the universe, it did have a beginning, that God comes before creation because he created the universe, created by his will, and it can be ended according to God's will. Some of the other points we can really kind of summarize, from miracles to the idea of resurrection and the afterlife, because these philosophers were really heavily influenced by these Greek philosophers. They looked for rational understandings of Islam rather than religious truths. And so Al-Ghazali just tried to refocus the idea on, what we see is what we get in terms of, the faith, and that, the transcendent God, is someone who transcends human reason and natural order. So some of the miracles and, seemingly unexplainable ideas and events that happen, they can go back to the fact that there is a transcendent God, and really focusing in on the heart of, that in particular in terms of the afterlife, that it really draws people's attention to what they should be doing, and it provides a moral incentive to do right and wrong, and that guides adherents to live their faith a certain way. Then we move to the idea of the revival of the religious sciences. So it aimed to revive the inner dimensions of worship and ensure that acts of devotion were performed with sincerity, mindfulness, and true spiritual understanding. So again, it's about not just what you think, but you've got to live that knowledge as well. And parts of this focuses on that challenge we mentioned earlier about that gap between the legalistic approach of the jurists and the spiritual approach of the Sufis, and really wanted to focus in on the morality, the ethical aspects of faith, rather than just the legal aspects of faith. So he still reaffirmed the core tenets of Islam, and sort of just trying to pull back some of the movement of the intellectual trends that were occurring at the time, that were drawing people away from the way they should live their faith. And this contribution also helped the education system. It provided a more holistic approach to learning that was practical, ethical, and spiritual. And then we come to the final text, The Deliverance from Error. And in many ways, this is an autobiography of sorts, where it focuses in on his own personal spiritual and intellectual journey. And it sort of, I guess in many ways, Al-Ghazali's attempt to look at all the various schools of thought that existed in his time, but then made the argument for the Sufi path, and why that is a great way to find that inner peace. So he defends Sufism against its critics, and illustrates the fact that it is very much compatible with Orthodox Islam. Remembering, of course, that at this particular time, Sufism was really on the outer when it came to Orthodox ideas of Islam. So it provides a roadmap to navigate the intellectual as well as the spiritual challenges, which in many ways kind of draws aspects of a lot of the stuff that we've spoken about so far, and goes to reaffirming the foundations of Islamic faith. And then let's look at the impact. So we've seen these contributions. Now, what were the impacts that occurs, the consequences of those contributions mentioned? Knowing the fact that we've already kind of touched on aspects of the impacts, even as we describe those contributions. So, firstly, in the the response to the idea of faith versus reason, through work such as The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he defended Orthodox Islam. So the debate itself, it enriched Islamic intellectual life, and of course leads to the development of diverse philosophical schools of thought that come after Al-Ghazali. His ideas resonate in works of later thinkers. Oftentimes when we're looking at key individuals, particularly in studies of religion, their impact is the way in which people after them kind of continue the work that they started in their lifetime. And in the case of Al-Ghazali, his contribution, his impact extends even beyond Islam. Some of you who do Judaism, you might be well familiar with Moses Maimonides, and certainly Moses Maimonides was influenced by aspects of Al-Ghazali. And in terms of our own Catholic faith, St. Thomas Aquinas also was very much aware of Al-Ghazali. And Al-Ghazali's idea of logic in terms of Islam eventually was incorporated into the madrasa curriculum. So it goes into the education system. If you think about all the various individuals that go through this education system, that there's a continuation of this impact from Al-Ghazali's contributions to highlighting the importance of faith over reason. Not saying that reason has no place, but indicating that there is a way of blending both faith and reason. You need both, and looked at the excesses of reason that sort of took people away from the way they lived their faith. In terms of sectarianism, which was an aspect that we discussed before, so Al-Ghazali's works on spirituality, ethics and mysticism, it offers a pathway for individuals from both Sunni and Shiite backgrounds. Remember, Sufism kind of transcends both variants, so there are things that could be learnt from Al-Ghazali's Sufism on both sides of thinking, and in particular, Al-Ghazali's attempts to he aspired towards the Ummah, the community of Muslims, helps to kind of just slow down some of the movement, to make sectarian splits even greater than they were. And so Al-Ghazali ultimately has a legacy of tolerance and inclusivity, which continues to this day to inspire efforts to overcome sectarian divisions within the Muslim world, even in today's world. So in an era that was marked by sectarian conflict, Al-Ghazali's great vision of a united Muslim community, it remains relevant and aspirational for Muslim adherents that live in today's world. In terms of Sufism, and as I said, we've kind of mentioned Sufism across, he ultimately legitimized Sufism within Islam. He reconciled some of the differences that occurred between Sharia, Islamic law, and Sufism, Islamic spirituality. His writings provided a solid foundation for reconciling the idea of mysticism with mainstream Islamic theology. His texts, they became foundational texts for generations to this day of Sufi thinkers and those that practice Sufism. So ultimately, his impact on Sufism was transformative because it provided intellectual legitimacy, spiritual guidance, and a theological framework for the practice of Islamic mysticism, even within the broader context of more orthodox ideas and understandings of Islam. This is just an extra slide I've put in here. Now, Al-Ghazali has a lot of different names, but two of the names that I think sometimes are good to refer to because the names themselves kind of get to the heart of explaining his significance, his legacy, and what he wanted to achieve and what he was successful in achieving. So being given the title of the Proof of Islam, well, you get that because it signifies that he was a leading authority in Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and philosophy, and he was someone who defended the faith, that his ideas weren't to move people away from the faith, they were there to bring people back. That ultimately his title of Proof of Islam is one of many ways in which we can see that he helped Muslim adherents live their faith. And the other title, the Renewer, I think is really good in terms of looking at the development and expression of Islam, because it highlights the fact that he had a role as a reformer, someone who renewed Islamic thought. Being a reformer doesn't necessarily mean that you chuck out everything that was in the past. Sometimes the stimulation of discussion and thought helps to stimulate greater understanding of the faith and helping people to see new ways to really rediscover their faith and to live their faith. So I think if you've got an ability to include those two titles at some point, it just gives you an opportunity to say a lot with so very few words there. Okay, so at the end of the day, all of that content that we looked at, we still need to be able to know how to respond in the types of questions that you'll get in the HSC. So over the next couple of slides, just got a few past papers, both short answer and extended response, just to sort of give you an idea about the way in which you might approach these questions. So in the 2023 short answer section, you had this one: how is the contribution of one significant person or school of thought, other than Muhammad and the four rightly guided caliphs, evident in Islam today? So in many ways, you're really just explaining the contribution. Now, it doesn't specify how many particular contributions you do. I would always encourage that you do more than one, and it's really about focusing in on any of those contributions that we discussed throughout this particular video, and just provide, as mentioned there, in terms of the criteria, that to get that 5 marks, it needs to be accurate and it needs to be detailed. And really, if we look at the difference between the 5 mark and the 4 mark, it does go down to the idea of detailed. So providing information on multiple contributions of Al-Ghazali is one way that you can sort of get into that. And in doing so, you can start to bring in particular examples as well. So focusing in on the contributions, and rather than just focusing on contributions as maybe the names of his writings, focus in on his responses to those challenges as the way in which you draw attention to his contributions. Then we look at the extended response question: how does Islam guide adherents towards living a better life? And this particular one, it was not only looking at Al-Ghazali, but also looking at whatever you did for ethics or significant practices. And with this particular question, where we're looking at the positives of the way in which Muslim adherents, and we always think about, when we think about that whole idea of living, think about today. So for Muslims living today, how were the contributions and impacts of Al-Ghazali? How did they lead Muslims today to live a life, a better life as such? And there's certainly a lot that you can draw your attention to, even just getting into some of the big broad issues of Al-Ghazali. Focus in on that debate, his inner struggle that he has in terms of the head versus the heart. And it's really looking at not just what you know about your faith, but ultimately it's, the heart is how you live your faith, how you have a personal relationship with God, and how that can kind of guide Islamic adherence towards a better life. So their actions, in terms of ethics, their morality is going to be shaped by this understanding of getting to the heart of the faith and the personal relationship with God. And looking at the criteria here again, it's about being sustained, and certainly in this case, making sure that you don't just refer to Al-Ghazali, that you bring in the other aspects of Islam. And obviously, those of you watching it, there's a whole range of different topics that you could do. But if you think more broadly about the various ethical aspects of Islam, if we're going to focus in on Al-Ghazali in terms of his contributions and this whole idea of focusing in on the personal expression of faith, well, if you have adherents who not only know the faith but are prepared to live by it, then they're going to make the correct ethical choices. So the most likely it's going to draw adherents towards following the ethical teachings that you might do. Or in the case of significant practices, it is going to encourage Muslims not just to learn about their faith, but to live their faith. And remember that significant practices, in many ways, is about how one lives their faith. It's the things that they do today to be part of their faith. So we can definitely see some connections there between Al-Ghazali and whatever you did for ethics and significant practices. Okay, having a look again at a short answer question. 4 it's going back a long way in terms of 2013, but outlining the contribution to Islam, again, for 3 marks, you probably really only need to focus in on any one of the contributions that we looked at in terms of Al-Ghazali, and being able to sort of provide just some basic details about his contribution. And the second part, in terms of the 6 mark, how effective, you're really looking at it almost gets into the idea of an evaluate question, because how effective you are providing a judgment, and you're looking somewhat at the consequence. So in this one, the 3 mark part is sort of looking at the contribution in raw form, and then the 6 mark question is looking at, okay, well, that contribution, what were the consequences? How effective was that contribution in doing what it intended to do? So you could, again, use those challenges that Al-Ghazali faced as being the foundation for that. Then in terms of the 2015 short answer, you've got some questions here. So identify 2 contributions. So again, it's a 2 mark. It's an identify. So it's really just making sure that you identify 2 different contributions. So while you could certainly pick 2 of his writings, I always think it's good to think of contributions in the broader fashion of the responses to the challenges of the day. And in the 5-mark question, summarize the impact. Again, it's really just providing detail on that impact. So looking at those contributions and going through, well, what were the consequences of each of these contributions? What legacy, what lasting effects did they have on the way that Islamic adherents live their faith today? And then another extended response question. I chose this one just because, when we looked at his title as a renewer, I thought it's one example of how we can certainly see Al-Ghazali would relate to this particular question. So you have the stimulus there: men, women, and schools of thought have reformed and/or revitalized the Islamic tradition. How well does this statement reflect the impact on Islam? So again, how well, it really is an evaluate question. You can see there in the criteria that you need to provide a reasoned judgment. But you do need to look at that stimulus, and in many ways you're looking at the way in which the contributions of Al-Ghazali made impacts in terms of how Islam is practiced today. So when we look at reformed, okay, generally that's perhaps making improvements upon, and certainly we see that in the way that he challenges the thought process and the focus in on the legalistic aspects of Islam rather than the way that one lives their faith. And in terms of revitalize, it's looking at, well, how does it stir the faith in a way that adherents are encouraged to live their faith in a new heightened way, and certainly focusing in on his Sufi teachings and the way in which it revitalizes this whole idea of getting to the heart of faith and being able to live one's faith. Okay, and just to end, just some tips for success. This is by no means the only tips that one can find, but like I said at the beginning, know your syllabus. Your syllabus is your friend when it comes to the course, so know the syllabus so you're able to pretty much go into the exam with no surprises. There's nothing you can be surprised about in many ways if you focus in on, I've mentioned there in the third point, living religious tradition. Every single question you're going to be asked in relation to the faiths, so in this case Islam and Al-Ghazali, it's always going to go back to what does it have to do with Islam being a living religious tradition. And it kind of contrasts, for those of you that do studies of religion too, when you look at ancient religions, those religions, we do look at them primarily through a historical lens. But when we look at religions such as Islam, there are Muslim adherents that they live their faith. They don't always go through the amount of study that you do in terms of studies of religion, but they live it. It's part of their day-to-day living. And even though someone like Al-Ghazali lived all those years ago, he has still had an impact in the way that Muslim adherents live their faith. Just to move back up there, keep content simple. Focus in on what is important. The marker isn't necessarily interested in everything that you've learnt over the course of 2 years. They want to see how you use the content to respond to the questions that are placed in front of you in the HSC. So with that, read and spend time working out what the questions are actually asking of you. Sometimes students just go straight in and they dump everything that they've ever learnt, everything they remember, everything that they've practiced and revised, when ultimately the question is steering you in a particular place, and often there are key words that you need to focus in on. And with that, in terms of your reading time, start to plan your responses. And when it comes time to writing, be direct and explicit. Don't spend too much time building up to your major points. Get straight in there, and that can certainly help in terms of time management. It's not always how long your responses are. You can write responses 100 pages, but if it doesn't actually answer the question, it's not going to do anything for you. The next point there is something I always encourage my students. While obviously studies of religion may be a subject that you felt that you had to do, you've chosen to learn about the subject, and so immerse yourself in the subject. There are plenty of places you can go to learn more about people like Al-Ghazali. Jump onto YouTube, have a look at documentaries that are there. Look for scholarly articles as well as other articles that might be there about Al-Ghazali, because even though he hasn't been around for a while, he still has a lot to say about Islam in today's world. So just immerse yourself into the subject and enjoy it. And the next one there, practice. You should be doing practice responses, bombarding your teachers with responses, because the feedback you get from your teachers is one of the most effective strategies for success. And the last part, since we are part of a system of Catholic schools, lean on your personal faith as well, because God is always there, ready to support you and to help guide you, and in many ways help relieve some of the anxiety and stress that you might be feeling as you get closer to the exam. And the good thing about studies of religion is you have generally religion teachers that are guiding you through that, and I'm sure they're more they're very much prepared to help you and support you in terms of your personal faith and getting you through the challenge of the HSC. So I hope that this presentation has been something that will help you continue your study of Al-Ghazali, and I'll make this certainly available to you. So good luck and God bless.